what I'm looking to do is review with you how you felt about SAP testing. We've talked about it already. We've seen interest in it in the part of our crop consultants and our crop advisors as to how we can better evaluate fertility and our own products, which products fit into different places. But if we can make this tool useful and helpful to you, then it loses its value to us. So our next 35 minutes is we'd look to get feedback, input from you as to if you learned anything or what you saw from doing the SAP analysis this past year. How many? Just raise your hand. How many people? I think there's 6 or 7 of us in here that did SAP analysis. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I thought, oh yeah, okay. There's at least 6 of us.
We had no apples, so it didn't make any difference.
Yeah.
We did about 1 SAP test.
So, when you went into this, was there anything specific you were hoping to learn about a specific variety, or can you just share with me or share with us all here when you said, well, let's do some SAP testing, and we know it's a series of tests. Was there anything that you specifically were hoping to learn and on your orchard? Go ahead.
We had problems with bitter pit on a Honeycrisp block. I don't want to say forever, but for a long time. We had done soil tests and fruit analysis, and obviously when you do fruit analysis on an apple that's got bitter pit on it, I mean, you know you failed. It's just kind of a reaction of how bad was it actually. So I think we were excited just to kind of see how things progressed and where in the process would be the best point to kind of intervene to try and turn things around. And I think that one thing that we've learned and that we like about doing the SAP testing is that it'll give you a consistent, run throughout the season. So at the end of the year, you could look at your data and just kind of see, maybe where in the season things went awry, or was it carryover from something that maybe you've been doing culturally incorrect for a couple of years. And I think that's one of the things we learned was, Gramps started putting potash on the ground in August, and that's just what they did. That was just one of the cultural things that he did every year is he'd get the big moon traveler and fill up the fertilizer spreader with potash and drive around the orchard just every August, because that's what you did every August. Well, as it turned out, if there wasn't a lot of rainfall in August and September, a lot of that potash really didn't go anywhere. So it just kind of sat there. So we'd start the year off with piles of potassium in the ground. So like I was saying, I think what the SAP test really done was just showed us where we're starting the year, showed us what happened throughout the year, and showed us where we're finishing. So it really shed light on just kind of the whole process.
How many times did you do the SAP testing?
I believe we did 5, maybe
6. I think 6.
This year?
They were 6, yeah. Most people would do 6 or 7. I think we had some grape growers that did 8, I believe. Is that right, Eric?
It depends on how early you start and how late you go. If it's a later variety, you might get an extra step.
Question, JP. Did you do a comparison with that one block versus another block to see what the differences were?
Not this season. Last season, and possibly 2 years ago, I was doing kind of a comparison of between White Bear and Preston. I can't recall exactly what those results were right now. what I've done was now we're doing all the sap testing at White Bear because it was just logistically too tough to get the leaves collected from down there in a timely, proper manner. But one of the other things that we've learned is that we are fortunate to have 2 growing sites, but they are dramatically different. We've really altered the spray program at both places now, where Preston and White Bear are just, I don't want to say light years apart, but we have to treat it as such just because they're so different.
And the difference is primarily the soil?
Primarily the difference in Preston is 3+% organic matter. It holds water, the soil holds water. White Bear is so sandy. It could rain at Preston and 5-6 days later you'll still have puddles in the orchard. There's areas where there's 3 feet of just perfectly black dirt topsoil and then slate limestone underneath it. White Bear is a gravel pit, basically, sand and gravel, not much else. So when it rains there, we might get 2 inches of rain, and 5 days later we'll be irrigating because there's nothing. The soil moisture is just drops like crazy. The other thing with Preston is warmer. Things green up earlier. We've had it in the past in some odd years where things have been almost 2 weeks ahead.
Thank you. That's good. Anybody else have? Dave?
We have a problem soil. We have some high magnesium and some deficiencies, and I kind of think there's some other things that typically we don't measure, and so we wanted to see from the SAP analysis what we might find out that was new information. We had some problems that made things hard to interpret, but one thing that I did notice that in using the Agro-K micronutrient sprays and also the systems ready in response to some low readings and certain things, we definitely were able to move them and see that was happening. Later on, when that went up, and I think the boron was one that was getting a little bit ahead of us, and we dropped back in response to that, and it was a good way to actually see what was going on.
Thank you. Anybody else? Dick?
Yeah, I think I started it because the summer tour was going to be at my place, and it would be, somewhat helpful. My impression is that it's a good indication of immediately throughout the year, but I'm also thinking if you did it multiple years, you would have sort of a history, a backlog to contrast and compare to.
Because no year's the same weather, right?
And especially last year.
Yes.
It was just another one of those unusual, typical Minnesota winters or summers. And Eric was a great help. He came out and got the leaves a lot of times.
Yes. He is. And that reminds me, Eric maybe will have a chance to show us how to sample and how to package to prepare it to ship, because once you learn it, it's pretty easy, but the first time it's like, where do I go? How do I get this done? It's hard, but go ahead.
The one thing that I could use, because oftentimes I don't even know what I don't know, I could use more help on interpretation.
Okay, good. That's what we hope to do after lunch, is we're going to try to make this, so this kind of a graphic, you get back and you say, well, this was probably bad, this is where I should be, and this is excess. How do I really interpret that? And what we're definitely seeing is that there is a lot to making a plant balanced. These nutrients, even in small amounts, like the boron, the moly, all of those can easily throw something out of balance. My observation in doing sap testing is that by sampling every 2 weeks, it really enhances the intensity of the grower on his crop. If you're sampling every 2 weeks, waiting for that result, you get that result, we got to do something, you see? Oh, it's low here, it's deficient here, it's excessive here. What do you do about the excesses? So it really puts your attention on that crop and that problem. Whereas sometimes if you sample with a tissue test once or twice, it's like, well, yeah, we did that. And, you know, this here is a programmed approach to really focus your attention on what is happening. And that is valuable. That is so valuable. You could say, well, I scout, I'm looking there, but are you, you know, I see the leaves, they're looking a little off or whatever. You will know. You'll know what's going on by doing the SAP analysis and getting that read back and that feedback. So I think that is a valuable thing from our standpoint of working with growers. When the grower is really intense about it and wants to monitor it and know what's going on, that's a good thing. Now, if you get the information back and you say, well, that's nice information, but I'm not going to apply any manganese or I'm not going to apply any calcium, I'm just going to let it go, you're wasting your money, really. You get the information, you ought to utilize that information right away. The timeliness of the application and the participation in it is really good. So that was my little sermon. Anybody else? Jim, you SAP test? You strawberries, right? Or did you?
I was thinking while you're talking that we had really good growth last fall on our strawberries. I think most people did. And, I think we set a lot of buds and we have potential for a really good crop this year. The SAP testing can give us some good insight so that as we try to develop that crop, we don't run short at certain. I think there's going to be maybe a lot of pressure on getting enough berries ripe and having those plants fired up this spring. So that's kind of what I'm looking at is something that'll be really helpful this coming year.
Good. Other?
I just used it on strawberries, and I thought it was kind of interesting, and we followed the program that Agro-K has, but we do a SAP testing, and before we get the results back, I would spray whatever Agro-K was recommending at that time, and then I wanted to look at the results. And it seemed like that the results indicated that what we sprayed before we got the results seemed like it was what was really recommended. I know we were short on moly and a few other micronutrients, but that was part of this great program that we were using. So I felt like we were actually getting a little bit of ahead of things before the results came back by following the Agro-K program. And I thought it worked out really well. I wanted to know also for the nitrogen levels, because I thought that we can keep the nitrogen levels at an adequate rate or a good rate, we can prevent some diseases by having excess. And I think that was the case. I think we were able to know that we didn't have to spray nitrogen this time. Things the plants were doing well.
Thank you for that comment, because that reminds me of the nutrient sequencing, that graphic that we put out there for the apples or grapes or whatever. There is certain nutrients needed at certain times through the whole growth phase of the season. I mean, that's basically how we build the program. And for the most part, I mean, I've had growers say, well, it kind of confirms that the program is on the money in terms of what is needed. Now, the weather, the stress, the fruit load, whatever might require some adjustment, but the basic program is there to, bring that crop through, and then you fine tune it and balance it. So I think that's a good point. Eric went to you put that up there. This is basically how we build a fertility plan. We would look at this and the nutrient demands that a plant has to get into production. And that green, of course, is calcium. You can see, as the discussion has been, that calcium. Now it's the right form of calcium. Agro-K, I think I counted up, I think we have like 7 different forms of calcium or combinations of calcium. So it's like, well, which calcium should we use? Well, there's a calcium for a pre-bloom, and then there's once the fruit is on, and then once when you're finishing that So it's part of our learning curve to use this to get your feedback to make good observations so we can maximize that fruit quality and watch that. So that is good. But could you put back up the graphic, the arrow key, okay. I've been pulling the water off the table here.
Larry, does this one have the new products on it?
Excuse me?
Does this visual have the new products on it?
Not really. It has the basics. It has boron on there, but it doesn't even have moly on there. And someone else pointed out it doesn't have manganese on there. What are we doing putting it up here without manganese on there when we just said manganese is critical to managing this?
So that needs to be updated then?
It does, yeah. Hit the arrow going up.
Try it, see what happens.
That's not the one I'm looking for. I'm looking for the,
It's the last slide in that presentation.
last slide in the presentation, okay. Oop, go the other way. So, you know, I've been looking at sap analysis on grapes, on just about any crop, and I was like, you know, it's just a lot of information. But as soon as we start graphing it and showing from the beginning of the season through the end of the season, you start seeing nutrient patterns in your results. One of the things that I did note is that in most cases, in the last sap test, you can see the micronutrients dropping off dramatically. Now, why is that? Well, because we stopped foliaring. We're maybe just putting on calcium and potassium, KDL if we need color. Otherwise, we're just putting on calcium. So, you see there, the sulfur went lower, these potassium was real low, manganese is low, calcium is low. So what did that indicate? On the grapes, it's even more dramatic. To me, it said the importance of doing a fall post-harvest feeding. If we're evaluating where we are and then the harvest is done and our leaves are telling us, all the boron and the moly and the zinc is low, what are we going to do for better overwintering? So, it was an impetus for me to really start looking at the fall post-harvest feeding program and buck up those nutrients and get those plants ready for dormancy. And we're going to have more time. Thaddeus is going to talk to us about that.
Did you folks think that this year, because there was so much moisture, that there was a calcium issue? Would you change your recommendations in a real moist year like we just had?
Did they adjust based on your, did they adjust your?
This is really my first year in this sap kind of
Okay.
stuff, so.
I know some places we did. I can't recall if Del or Eric, you had put on more calcium.
But in general, would you recommend that in a much wetter year?
Well, it seems like more calcium seems to benefit, particularly the orca. The calcium chloride in a wet year shines. It shines. Is that right, Paul? When you use calcium chloride or calcium you can get by with a lot of rain without any phyto or any scarring. But the orca DL is really, we have been able to soften that up and spray 2 quarts of orca without any issue at all. So that, I feel very comfortable in making that recommendation without saying, oh, you're going to create a phyto issue or scar. Eric.
Are you thinking that the chloride and the calcium chloride is helping manage is that a possibility, I guess?
Well, sodium, stabilizes that's one of the biggest problems in honeycrisp.
Okay.
They seem to stabilize each other.
Yes,
The leaf analysis, you
Randy.
gotta just do like one variety. You can't mix the leaves with different varieties.
That's right. And I think if I'm going to do leaf or tissue analysis, you have to do more than one. I would do one pre-bloom, early, get one early after fruit is set, and maybe one, just before harvest or whatever, to know what we need to do to put those plants to sleep. So I would do at least 3 tissue tests on apples if you're going to use tissue testing. Anybody disagree with that, Paul?
I would say you can do a tissue sample. You tissue sample that tree every 2 weeks for 3 years, and it'll tell you how it grows. I did it in cherries a long time ago, and it taught me about how trees really grow. That, I think it's...
If you're going to do it that often, then why don't you do sap testing? That was before you had the technology, right?
Get right into it. I understood it.
Yeah.
That plant was moving.
Yeah,
It's just a more specific way of doing it.
sure.
And I would say that if you're intensively managing the trees, more testing is going to give you more information as to how to manage it. So if you're only spraying a variety that isn't returning a lot, then less testing will
Well,
probably.
it also has sodium and all the other trace minerals that the other test doesn't have too. I mean, it shows more.
Yes, the sap analysis does give you more components that they're evaluating than what you'll find in a regular tissue test. That is true. All right, any more comments? So, Mr. Rob Ford, he does corn and beans. Can you tell us what the soil or how you use the sap testing and from?
I think probably the main thing that I picked up over the sap testing, I've done it 3 years now, and balance is a huge key. That's one thing that we've learned from this. Back the first year we did this, I would pull the leaves for the sap analysis, and then I would also pull a traditional leaf sample, send them in and compare them. And I think the sap analysis teaches us to look at what's excessive and manage that, what's excessive, manage that just as much as you would manage what's deficient. Where I was at on a traditional leaf sample, if something came back that was high, you just said, well, we don't have to worry about it, it's high. But now with the sap analysis, you say, okay, it's excessive, we have to start managing that. And like 2 years ago, if you would have told me that high potassium was detrimental to corn or anything at reproductive stage, I would have laughed at you. I'd laughed at you. But now, these last 2 years, I've proved to myself that, hey, this extra potassium is a problem, and it's creating a calcium magnesium deficiency. And so going forward, we'll actually use the calcium and magnesium to manage the high potassium.
Okay. So he makes another good point is that the excesses, many times we always worry about deficiencies, and we want to correct deficiencies by making another foliar application, but the excesses create imbalances and create a problem too. So how do you solve an excess problem, Rob?
Well, what I do is, you take what's excessive and then you figure out what's deficient and see if there's a relationship if one's causing the other one.
Okay.
I really like that calcium or the potassium to calcium ratio that you get on the sap testing. I think that's imperative.
So when you're working with soils, you're looking at long-term more than immediate, or is there immediate things that you can do, like to correct an excess?
I think with the SAP testing, you're always looking to correct an excess. I think it's a long-term approach, and I think you basically have to address that individually. I don't think you can make a blanket statement.
Yeah.
Excessive, but so maybe the SAP analysis teaches you to deal with what's deficient in the short run, and then teaches you to deal with what's excessive in the long run.
So when we look at results like this, do you think it's mostly all soil? The nutrients are all coming from the soil, or is it coming from the foliar program that we're putting in? What's your feel about that?
You know, for lack of a better term, your foliar program is kind of like the icing on the cake. It's that little immediate bump right there. But longer term, you still have to have a balanced soil. Your balanced soil helps you offset these environmental surprises, you know, the hailstorm, the windstorm, the freeze,
Yep.
whatever. And the one reason most foliar applications don't work is that say your soil is really low on manganese, and you make a foliar application of manganese. It looks great in the short run. At the end of the season, you do a treated and untreated, and they're the same. It's because your soil was so short on that nutrient, and your foliar application just gave you a short-term bump.
So that's one of the things that I want to re-emphasize. He set me up for this, Rob did, is that you have to have the groceries in the soil to better utilize our foliar program. If you run short in your soil fertility, see what we're doing, we're using these phosphites which are stimulating that plant to flush more roots and search for more nutrients in that root zone. So it's looking for more zinc, it's looking for more manganese, and if we have a soil way out of balance and it's not finding it, it's not going to get it up. So what we're doing is we're actually accelerating the need for a well-balanced soil, that we have to work at that. And it takes 2-3 years to get that soil there, but it has to be our emphasis, is that we want that soil right. And we can't rely always on these foliars to do the job, because we're going to flush that root system. The nutrients are not there. We did put a little bit of manganese on, but it wasn't in the amount that was needed to make that quality. So it is in a combination. They are working together. Jim.
So Larry, particularly with looking at trees, with potassium, it's always interesting to look at the soil when you test your soil. And the thing that I always have in my mind is how representative of that is that of the potassium in the soil, given their extraction methods. Because in my neighborhood, for years and years, a lot of this was in dairy over the years, and the standard operating procedure in my neighborhood was, well, if you got alfalfa hay, then you put 300 pounds of calcium or potassium chloride on every spring and you'll be good. And there's a lot of potassium in the soil, and I think there's a lot more potassium than what the soil tests even show when I pull a soil sample. Based on what I'm seeing with sap or with leaf or fruit analysis, I think there's more potassium than what my soil test is showing, but I can't really put my finger on it, but that's what I think is going on. Any thoughts on that?
Anybody else? Rob.
You know, I don't know which lab you're using for your soil test.
He uses Midwest.
It's Midwest now, okay.
Yeah. If you will talk to them, are your levels saying that your potassium is high?
Generally, my soil tests show it's moderate to high.
Okay.
It's not excessive. But the way I see when I do tissue analysis of that, I'm looking at that saying, I think there's more potassium in my soils as the plants are interacting. And, you know, you put on things like System Cal and whatnot, you're getting a root flush, and there just seems to be more available potassium than what my soil tests are saying. have a potassium bank in the soil is what I'm thinking.
Yeah, and most, if you'll talk to your lab, there are some labs that if they'll say, I ran into this years ago, that the soil test said we were high in potassium, but we were so visually short on the leaf that we had bronzing and everything for the short potassium. When they rate that at high, or they have an H behind it, that means that it's high for your soil type. And then the other people will say, well, you've got to have 550 parts per million, or I think a lot of it is 300 parts per million. What's really key is you go out to that base saturation on that sample, and you want that potassium, say like 3 to 5%. That's the most important number on that sheet, is keeping that in that 3 to 5%, whatever their range is. But as far
Pay no
as
attention to the low, medium, and high is what you're saying.
yeah, because depending on the lab, that's probably they're talking about for your soil. It's high for your type of soil.
So how does Ward Labs, we've exposed these people to all Ward Labs, remember?
Yeah.
And how do Ward Labs rate, when they rate potassium, is it similar to Midwest?
I don't know exactly. I don't know how they run their tests, but I just go off the percentage of potassium anyway. I mean, I've seen where I've had low soil, like a 2% base saturation in potassium, and had 550 parts per million, and we still show potassium deficiency in the leaves. And then I've been the other, compared to your calcium and magnesium.
So is there a safe range that you would like to see it, so Jim has a feeling for it?
And your lab will tell you, they'll give you a pie chart of the ideal, and I believe potassium is 3 to 5%. And it'll vary by lab, but they all have their ideal, and basically 3 to 5%.
Okay.
It'll vary too, what time of year you take your soil sample too. I mean, your potassium availability will vary, so keep that in mind also.
Explain that to me. How does that work if I pull a spring sample versus a midsummer sample?
Well, I would think that, the way I would understand it is if you, like say, if the soil temperatures are cold, your potassium levels aren't going to, if you take a soil sample, they're not going to be as high, but then, later on in the spring when your biology is, cooking and doing what it should be doing, it's going to be a little bit higher. And then in the summertime when your soil temperatures are even warmer, you might see a little bit higher analysis even then.
So the potassium is there. Their extractive method then is relative to the soil microbial activity and temperature.
As I understand it, yeah.
The other thing is, if you take a test late fall after you've taken the crop off, your levels are going to be lower because you've taken a crop off. But if you took it in the fall and then come back and took it in the spring again in the same spot, it'll go up over the winter. And that's why it's so important to test at the same time of the year. Because
this seems important, is that the testing, I've always thought of the testing as being, it's kind of a static thing. There's so much potassium in the soil, and your extraction method is pulling out whatever is there. But if these other variables affect that, that's really important to keep an eye on that. That's helpful. Yeah.
Well, when we were doing the microbial count, we saw that too, that at different times of the year, you see more biology and more activity. And actually, I would think it was late fall was almost the highest biology, wasn't it?
Yeah, it get clear into like the first part of August was your highest biology. And then, another thing that can affect the potassium is compaction. If you've got a very compacted soil, you're going to...
These are orchards we're talking about. We're all compacted. We don't till them much.
It's important to take it the same time of year because it changes. And a lot of guys will get busy, have a late fall.
So would you ask for a different extraction method? You can do, you can request
There's different extractions. The Haney test is a much softer extraction. All that testing we did the last couple of years, we could never find our potassium in that Haney test. It's a tough one.
You understand the Haney test? You remember we talked about that a couple years ago? That it's like a total soil profile, health profile that we were trying to develop. We haven't gone away from it. It just now sap testing's taken over.
How many soil tests should you do, like 3 a year, like spring, midsummer, and fall, or?
How many soil tests should you, we've been doing once every 2 years. But if you're trying to figure out soil biology or something like that, that would be why it would require more tests. But in terms of amending the soil, you probably don't, you amend the soil yearly with gypsum or some phosphorus or potassium or whatever it calls for, I don't know. You wouldn't need to, I don't think, sample that frequently, no. There was somebody else had a comment. Paul?
I found very consistently when you have high potassium in the soil, it's not in the plant. And one thing I've done in the past is take a leaf sample and a soil sample together, sit it in. And what you're looking for is your true deficiency for the short and bold. And another thing I find low boron in the soil is high in the plant. And I don't understand it, to be honest with you.
Uh-huh. You had something, JP, on soil testing?
We've done soil tests on the historically problematic Honeycrisp bitter pit block, and it's just been absolutely through the roof. I mean, brutal potassium levels. Obviously we stopped doing the potash in the fall, but we started going with granular gypsum in the spring, early in the spring, and that's really helped. Stopping the potash was big, but getting more gypsum on the ground was also very helpful at trying to remedy that issue.
Yep. It seems to be a pretty consistent recommendation is gypsum helps with that bitter pit. We will continue a little bit of this discussion, or a lot of this discussion. Eric's going to give us a handle on how to better utilize our SAP test results. And any further question or comment that you have about SAP testing will be good at that time. Eric's going to come up and explain to us a little bit more about using SAP analysis information, how we can better understand it and better turn that into recommendations for our foliar and soil applications. So Eric's going to
Probably the most common question that we have, is the grower gets their results, and now what do we do with this? And I'm just going to go through real quick what the results are showing us, and then a sort of a step-by-step method to interpreting those results or making a recommendation based on those results. If any of you were here at the SAP testing seminar last year, John Kemp went over what he called his crop health pyramid. At the base, where we have successful photosynthesis as the first sort of goal the plant has. Second, we have the production of complete proteins as the next level of plant maturity or plant development. We have storage of surplus energy in the fruit sinks and roots and exudates, mainly in the fruit. And then finally we have the production of secondary plant metabolites. These are the things that help resist disease and insect predation. And when you're trying to maximize your yield potential, each successive layer of the pyramid kind of builds on the previous one. So it's very difficult to achieve the higher levels
without first addressing the photosynthesis part of it. So when we're looking at a sap test, we want to look at it with an eye towards looking for those elements that are going to sabotage these building blocks underneath what we actually harvest up here at the storage. And that's basically what our fertility programs were designed around. The generic ones, or the sort of catch-all ones that we tailor to individuals, time these nutrients with that in mind. Different times of the year, the plant will require different types of nutrients and different intensities. And we saw this slide earlier. Throughout the growing season, the plant is utilizing nutrients at different rates or levels. This slide again is dealing with those elements that are immobile, mobile, and then partly immobile, which means you're going to see deficiencies of immobile materials usually in the new growth. The mobile materials, you'll see deficiencies in the old growth. And the medium immobile, you can get a sort of a combination. You may see the deficiencies in different places based on the material and what's deficient. So when you've properly submitted the samples and you get your report back, this is typically what you will see. You'll get a PDF file that shows the various levels in the young and old leaves. In this case, the light green is the young leaf on top, and the old leaf is the heavy dark green line. And that differential, depending on whether the nutrient is mobile or immobile, will tell you which direction the plant is heading as far as that nutrient is concerned. If you have, let's see if I can find an example here. If you have, in this case, an adequate level in the new leaves of copper, for example, but a low level in the old leaf, since copper's moderately immobile, this new growth may be taking from the old growth somewhat, but you don't have a lot of reserves here. And that idea would be applied to something that's very mobile. You'd want to supplement that fairly quickly.
What about that zinc, fourth one from the bottom?
Zinc, here you have a low level in the new growth, but a fairly high level in the old growth. There's two things that can cause that. First, that the sample contamination is always possible, but this new growth is not getting the zinc. Since it's not easily mobile, it's probably worth applying a little bit of zinc at that time, even though you have quite a bit in the old leaves, would be my initial recommendation. We'll get into the recommendations specifically for zinc in a slide here. This was apple trees, actually Sweet Tango, and really quite a nice sap test. This was also taken June 29th, so the end of June, right before. At what stage would that be, JP, as June 29th?
Probably like
10 millimeters or?
probably closer to 20.
20? Okay. So fruit development about 20 millimeters, let's say. If you have any questions or we want to go back or forward, just let me know. This is the worksheet that John Kemp came up with that is going to help us evaluate our SAP tests and make recommendations. And if you remember, the crop health pyramid had, at the bottom level, was photosynthesis, and that's our number one here. So when we go to examine our SAP test, we want to concentrate on the nutrients in red in that first column. That's the first thing we want to do. Column 2 corresponds to the second level of the pyramid, the protein synthesis, and for that we want to focus on these three elements. Then we look at the excesses in our SAP test. I'll do a quick run through and then we come back and we'll go through in more detail. We look at the excesses. We have here the antidotes for those excesses that we've identified. It's not for all elements, but for these 7 of them, we have antidotes that we can apply to deal with excesses. And then finally, we identify deficiencies. After we've identified all these things, we evaluate whether we need a low dose or a medium dose or a high dose to deal with whatever deficiency or excess is happening here, and then we make our recommendations. Going back to the SAP test, we sit down with the SAP test and the worksheet in front of us. We start going through and identifying the items that are low within this first column. And I don't know if you have the SAP test in a legible form in front of you, but we've got magnesium as the first element, total nitrogen, phosphorus, iron, and manganese. Those 5 things are going to be critical to photosynthesis. Magnesium for the chlorophyll molecule, total nitrogen is part of the fuel for the factory. Phosphorus is key in that metabolism. Iron and manganese. So in looking at that SAP test, we had an adequate amount of magnesium. Magnesium here, we were actually just right in the sweet spot. This middle column is where we want to be with our nutrients. That's a adequate amount of the nutrient for whatever the plant is needing to do with it. At different times of the year or growing season, the plant may need may need more of that nutrient, but the first column represents a deficiency such that it'll cause a yield loss or injury to the plant. As long as we're in this middle column, we're generally all right. And depending on the nutrient, if we're in excess or a little bit deficient, it may be, the closer we are to this range, the less critical it is. Back to magnesium. We don't check anything here. Same with nitrogen and phosphorus. Let's look at iron and manganese, the last 2 here on that first column. And iron is definitely in the deficient area. That it's fairly certain that we're impacting yields at that point when we're more than halfway below into the deficient range. Manganese is borderline. We have some in the older leaves, but we could supplement that without any issues. With that in mind, manganese is also going to modify potassium. We're high in potassium. We could supplement that without any consequences that I'm aware of. Anyway, so we've marked these 2 in the first column. Now we move to the second column, protein synthesis. Under that, we want to look at sulfur and boron and molybdenum, both of those involved in the protein synthesis portion of the crop health pyramid.
Eric?
Yes.
When you do the SAP testing this year, is this something that will come back, or will it go through you and then you'll make the recommendation?
The worksheet that Larry handed out is something that we do on our own. I mean, the report we get back from the lab is this one here, and we take this one and put that information onto the worksheet to determine how we want to address any deficiencies or excesses. So this will all be available. We can send you an email of the Excel file, or if you don't have access to something that can print that out, or a PDF or something, we can print out a few of them for you just to make, so you can do these worksheets. Otherwise, we can, of course, go through them and make our recommendations for you if we've worked something like that out. So the upshot is the lab doesn't do this. We're doing this to interpret the lab's reports. So sulfur for the second column is fairly adequate in the old leaves, slightly under in the new. Because there's a fair bit in the old, I didn't consider that a deficiency so much, but this plant could probably benefit from some extra sulfur. So when we're looking at products to deal with other issues, we may want to make sure we use one that has sulfur in it to kind of bolster this aspect of it. Boron and molybdenum. We see that boron is quite low. We'll definitely want to supplement that. We put an X in that box. And then moly, it is so low that it hardly even shows on the report. So that is definitely something we want to supplement. So marked I just use a plus. These symbols are meaningless, just a place, just something to let us know that we're planning on adding. So we've taken care of photosynthesis, which is the bottom layer of the crop health pyramid. Protein synthesis, we've evaluated that. We could have put an X here for sulfur because it is a little bit low, but for now, left that open. We could come back and go through this twice just to make sure we didn't miss anything. Now we look at what are our excesses on any of these elements. And if we go back through the test, really potassium, this was a nice test. Really potassium was the only one in excess. And it wasn't badly in excess. It was right near the top end of the acceptable range. John Kempf has identified these 7 elements that act to modify these elements. So, for example, if you have excess potassium, you can help regulate that with manganese. Calcium you can help regulate that with boron. Magnesium, if you have excess magnesium, you can help regulate that with nitrogen, which helps utilize that magnesium in creation of other products, if that's the limiting factor. Calcium will help drive down excess sodium. Magnesium, sulfur, and moly will help push down nitrate. It helps convert it to total nitrogen from nitrate form. Magnesium, you see that nitrogen is the antidote for excess magnesium. Well, magnesium is also the antidote for excess total nitrogen. Zinc, relation with phosphorus. So we've identified an excess of potassium. One of the options we have is to add some manganese, so we put a plus there. And as it turns out, we're also deficient in manganese, so we doubly are going to make sure we have manganese in whatever application we do. So we've dealt with the photosynthesis, the protein synthesis, and the excesses. Now we want to look at the deficiencies. In going through the SAP test, we saw that calcium was really borderline low. It's not mobile. The calcium in the old leaves is not going to help us with the new leaves. We definitely need to supplement calcium here. Moving down the list, we come to iron. We know that's deficient from our first step. Boron and molybdenum. We know molybdenum and boron are low because of our second step here. So in our deficiencies column, we have calcium, iron, boron, and molybdenum. Now we get into just how much do we put on of these nutrients. We're going to want to be putting on calcium, iron, manganese, boron, and molybdenum. Now remember, this is a fairly early SAP test, and we don't have a lot of history with this crop for this year. What we do have for this year, since these tests were taken last year, we have the history from last year on how to predict how much response we'll get when we do an application of any particular nutrient based on our historical record. So I've gone through and collected the sap tests from last year and plotted them together to sort of see the trends over the season of last year. So when we get a new test this year, we can look back and say, well, here's where it was and what it did last year. We can add the same amount and hope for the same kind of response. And in this case, we were pretty much adding the recommended rates, so I'm calling that medium. If we were severely deficient, like with Molly, I may move that to high in retrospect after looking at how low it is. But you don't want to get too, for example, if you have deficiencies for two reasons, or let's say you have manganese you want to add to, as an antidote for potassium, and you're deficient in manganese, 2 pluses don't equal a high dose. That just doubly reinforces that you need some manganese, is what I'm saying. Anyway, that's a really quick overview. And this summary, Bemisting, which is the Crop Health Lab's website, does offer this as a, you can print out sort of the historical trend for each crop that you've identified the same, but I find that it's really hard to use. So we're going to be summarizing these for all the SAP tests we get in, basically. So if you want that, just let me know. We'll get that to you via email or whatever form you can get them in.
Eric, you got all of my results from the stuff that I did in Wall, right? Is that included in the evaluation or the summary from last year, or is this just the local stuff, the new weapon stuff?
For right now, I put this in manually. I request, when we do our SAP test request form, our label request form, we have to specify that we want the results in Excel format as well as the PDF. And when I get them in Excel format, I can just copy and paste those values into my spreadsheet, and it generates these graphs. And so now whenever I do a sample label request form, I automatically ask for the Excel format. Otherwise, we can go through and print them out off of Bemisting and slug our way through that.
So could you show us your recommendations, Eric, with the excesses and...
Oh, yes, thanks for reminding me. In this, so we've gone through and evaluated all these things. And for this application in late June, early July, I've identified some of the products here that would satisfy these requirements. We've got System Cal or Vigor Cal Boron Moly would be one product that would help with calcium, boron, and moly. And System Cal is going to help just put everything into the plant quickly. In addition, it has some copper, and copper wasn't deficient, but it's rarely, if it was in excess, I'd be more concerned about it. But we go down to iron. We can use Iron DL, which is a good product, high rate of iron. And that's not the iron that you see on your tissue test, which includes oxidized iron. This is sap, the iron in the sap, which is going to be usable by the plant. Or we could use, so Iron DL or a micromix package has a little bit of iron in it. If you were drastically low, you might want to go with the more intense Iron DL. And Larry, jump in if you have any.
Yeah, oh, that's good.
And then for manganese, we can do a System MN instead of System Cal if you wanted, or a manganese DL. And first of all, I'd take the standard recommendations that you were planning to do, go through and see if any of these are already on that. If they are, then you'd only supplement the ones that were not covered. Something like Topset is a good product for boron and moly. And then Vigor Cal Boron Moly again for the moly. I should have put Topset down here also.
This past year, we found that the growers who had irrigation, so greenhouse operations and some vineyards, they were low in manganese, and they put a couple of quarts of manganese through their drip. And the next time we did the sap test, they had moved the needle significantly. So it wasn't even a foliar application. It was just dripping it through the irrigation, and it moved it. So if you have that capability, you're not forced to foliar feed everything. You can easily drip it in too, and it seems to be very effective.
That's right, I should have mentioned, this is not specific to foliar feeding. It's like you say, fertigation, soil applied, and foliar feeding.
If you have a moment at the end of this, can you pull up the SAT test from 9.5 so we could look at those two comparatively to see basically where we went from the end of June to where we were at harvest based on, and what we did with the information that we got in the end of June and where we ended up.
Yeah, I can pull that SAP test up. I have it in here, the directory.
The low, medium, and high, is that referring to the need for the particular element? The high need or medium need or the dosage? I mean, I'm not quite
Sure. Good question. This low, medium, high, I think of it as it is the amount of product that you're putting on, but the way you want to evaluate whether you want to put more product on is through that historical SAP testing record or historical record. So if you see that your plant responds very well to a product, you may not want to double the amount that you put on. If it responds poorly or not a lot to the recommended rate, you may be inclined to put more on if you're very deficient in that.
It almost seems like
It's a real judgment call.
yeah, but Agro-K should almost have a recommended product and then have low, medium, and high for, you double it for high, you put.
Here's one of the things we found is that the timing, in other words, system CCAL is good early on to build a factory and get it ready to produce fruit. But once that fruit is set, you probably should back off of system CCAL and go to Vigor Cal or Orca or Calcium DL or some other form. Because unless you have a stress plant that needs seaweed and root flushing, it's better to go with the DLs. You see, so part of it is the timing and where you're at with your crop and which form you would use. Early on, you want the phosphate in there, you want the seaweed in there. You're cranking that plant to put the canopy on, get ready to set fruit, and so all of those components are going to help that. Once you've got that done, then you'll want to back off. You want to back off, and you're just concentrating now on getting that fruit to quality. So if you take one of those Honeycrisp Midwest sheets, you'll see phosphites are used early, and then it switches over to Vigor Cal or Vigor Cal. Sometimes we'll do Vigor Cal with boron. We won't do the Vigor Cal Molly. We'll just do Vigor Cal with boron, or we'll just do straight Vigor Cal too. So, I guess until you know that or understand that, we have to help you. We have to help you understand which product to use.
Yeah, I can see that. Yeah, and consulting with you with the results and the chart, because like you're saying, the time of the year makes a difference.
Yes, it does. Now, the other issue, I've had growers come to me and say, I'm having so much trouble getting fruit set, and it usually rains and it blows, and it's just terrible, right, when I'm starting to pollinate. What does Agro-K do for that? And the one thing, you have a window of opportunity to help that plant pollinate and set fruit. And if the weather is terrible, we would recommend maybe repeating that pre-bloom application at least a half rate. In other words, you widen that window a little bit. So that window's this wide, and the weather didn't cooperate, so it's probably going to affect your fruit set. But if you repeat that sim spray, bigger cal boron, and some of those nutrients and put that in there again, you're opening that window and you're holding that window open just a little more longer to get that fruit set that you're looking for. So I've had growers that do that. If you're having a variety that's just terrible, that you can't get it to set, and the weather then doesn't cooperate, how are we gonna make it work? You know, start at maybe 15 days pre-bloom, knowing that I'm gonna hit this plant again in 10 days. So I broaden that window, I widen that window to accomplish that fruit set that I'm looking to do.
One other thing about this worksheet, we always want to address these things in order. So if we have needs in the photosynthesis column, we don't want to be applying, in this case, boron and molybdenum instead of iron and manganese, because even though they're both necessary, we want to focus on the base of the pyramid and work our way up. So if you have to make a choice on, for budget reasons or whatever reason, mixing conditions perhaps, we want to deal with them in order. In other words, that is best. The plant is going to respond best that way, I'd say.
There is a nutrient sequencing that we're trying to talk about here, whether we're showing you the graphic, there's nutrients that need to be there first to build on this, to build on this. So there's nutrient sequencing, that's what I would call it, where you make sure that you've got them there. You need them all, really, but sometimes it shows up deficient, it's not in the soil, and so then you've got to supplement, you've got to carry it with the foliar. Any more questions?
So you can see here's the September 5th test at the end, and here's the June 6th test here. So you see the trend is for potassium in this example to drop down. In fact, it crossed from young and old. This top bar is our high standard from crop health, or from Nova Crop Control. The bottom line is their deficiency. Anything below that is so deficient that it's going to cause plant injury. Anything above this line is in excess, depending on the nutrient, and can cause a toxic effect. This yellow horizontal line is a standard from Advancing Eco-Agriculture, or John Kemp, and that was one of their, they don't have a bracket, they use a target range. Now during the season, you may ideally want this potassium at harvest, for example, to be closer to the excess, whereas in May, ideally you'd want it further down, but still within this range. It's really hard to get potassium to swap its shape to fit our desires here, but at least in Sweet Tango. This is the calcium for the same time frame, September, June. And we see actually quite decent calcium numbers here.
Were you foliar in that calcium at that time? Yep. Okay.
Sodium will help pull water into the plant. It can add to crispness or make the cells expand tightly, like in cherries, but too much, and you can overdraw water into the plant and actually dilute the nutrients. There's a real happy medium. I can't imagine a situation where you would actually supplement sodium. It's usually not a big issue in most of the crops we grow. Same with chloride. We could switch to, if we had a nitrogen issue and we wanted to put a little chloride in, we could go with the Orca soft chloride or calcium chloride. And there are some nitrogen that does help some with nitrogen.
Chloride helps with some disease management and also the water capacity. That's what we're seeing with the chloride. Okay. Is there any comments or questions?
Well, actually, so going back to understand the colors in the first two columns correspond with the key nutrients for, at least in the first column, photosynthesis and the protein synthesis. Well, I don't understand why the next three columns are colored the way they are.
These three columns are the same color because they're all part of the same analysis. We're looking at excesses here, and this is a list of antidotes to excesses, and here's where we decide what we need to apply in order to deal with this excess.
Yeah.
All right, any more?
On calcium, how big a deal is it that the product actually hits the target, the fruit, the absorption through the fruit skin versus the leaves, and going so far as like a post-harvest dump in your bin dumper? Any benefits?
We actually have done some work on that. We've tried to research that and understand if we could enhance fruit shelf life by doing a drench or a wash of calcium, I believe it was. Can't remember which form we used, but it is, I mean, we thought maybe there was something there to it, but we haven't really, we can't say significantly that we've got the answer for it. You know, so basically we're putting it in the tree, letting the tree move it to the fruit, and, you know, I can't say that's, you know, but we understand what you're asking.
Okay, real quickly, and it's nothing fancy. One of the things that came up at this recent conference was that we might have to start taking samples earlier in the day. So, if ideally 2 hours after sunrise rather, and since that's probably not practical, especially if you have multiple blocks to test, at the very least you want to test your blocks in the same sequence that you always do. So if you get a block tested at 7 for one test, you want to try and make sure you do it at the same time for the next test. And if block 3 gets tested a half hour later, make sure you do it in the same order. That'll just help minimize the fluctuations based on sap pressure. When you get your bags and your labels, you're going to want to put down, this happens to be a blank one. Usually they'll come filled out with the information on there. You want to be real careful that you send in one label for the old leaf and one label for the new leaf. We've had a couple occasions where someone will accidentally send in 2 new leaf labels, and one of those goes into limbo because the software only lets them present one type of sample for that date. So it's a big chore to try and track down what happened. Yeah.
The first samples, it's just new leaf.
On the first sample, we use an old leaf label.
Old leaf, old leaf, new ones, and new leaf.
Yes, it's, and the reason for that is when you track it over time, you want that line to be consistent because you're sampling that leaf.
That's a fruit cluster, right? Is that when you take the first one?
It's a spur leaf. Yep.
When you pick it up, like, from the end of the leaf started, you're taking it. The very first one, or a couple back, or?
It's like Seth was saying, there's a sample guide that'll come with your labels, or you can look up. But the first fully developed leaf, and I usually take the 3rd or 4th leaf back from the growing point, and that's usually fully developed. And then if I've shifted from spur leaves to old new growth leaves, I'll find the growing point and count up 1 or 2 and take that one. Now the sampling guide says to take kind of in the middle of the new growth. It depends on your growth. If you're real short, the middle may be the first fully developed leaf. So I try to keep some kind of differential there just so we can see the trend. And the consistency is helpful, but since apples are a little bit of a different character, compared to strawberries where it's obvious which is the old and which is the new, and there's not much confusion. To go from spur leaves to new growth, old and new growth new, we still haven't nailed down completely how that relates to our fruit development yet. But we're working on it. We're trying to pay attention to it. We've got two kinds of insulated bags. You can. I found these at department store Walmart. I think 90 cents a piece, something like that. This kind is better than the polymer kind. It has a little more insulation, but either one will work. And you've bagged your samples. Make sure it's dated and affixed. Squeeze the air out. And then you can, there's the other kind of thermal bag, this hot / cold one. It's thinner, it's not quite as well insulated. And what I do is I put a box of these in the freezer, and I put 3 or 4 of those in a paper grocery bag to protect the leaves from touching. You don't want them actually touching the ice. Stick that in the middle and pack the leaf samples all around it, and put the whole thing in a FedEx box, and don't leave it at a kiosk. You want to bring it right to a store or call for pickup. And it will go to the address that we'll give you on the sampling guide, and you should be good to go.
FedEx is the only way they want it, right?
It has to be guaranteed overnight, and they deal with FedEx all the time. UPS, I don't know if I have ever sent. It's much less hassle to send it FedEx, is I guess the upshot of that. Also, about the only thing that changes over time if they're properly stored, if the samples are properly stored, is the ammonium levels in the sample. Those tend to change over time even if they're refrigerated. So if you have a sample that's been 5 days, you will have a higher ammonium concentration than it actually was when you took the sample. But we can deal with that. The expense of sending it overnight can be mitigated a little bit if the weather's decent. You could send it 2-day, pick it a day early, as long as you're storing and treating those samples just right.
Is it required to wash the leaves?
No, we don't want to wash the leaves. It tends to leach out nutrients, and it gives us a false reading on some of the nutrients. If you have a dew-covered leaf, you'll definitely want to blot them with a paper towel, and that means sitting down, putting a dry paper towel on the table, laying the individual leaf down, blotting it with another one, don't rub, and then putting it in the bag. So you got to do every single leaf. It takes a while.
Would you be worried about if you did a calcium spray a week before?
Surface contamination can affect the sap numbers. So if you schedule a spray, if the conditions are such that you have to spray it a day, for example, if you can at all send someone out to pick the leaves before you spray, that would be ideal. Otherwise, you're better off waiting a few days to sample and catch the next cycle than to take it right after a spray.
Would it be best to wait for a rain?
As long as you don't have to sample too close to a rain, because for the same reason that washing the leaves is a bad idea, rain can also skew some of the results. Dew doesn't seem to do that as much, but if you have a choice, there's only 2 days a week that we can ship samples, or they ship them out of the country. That's Wednesday and Friday, I believe. So you'd have to have the samples to them. You'd have to overnight them Tuesday or second day them from Monday. And we prefer to overnight them, but if they're well insulated, kept cold, we've had usable results from 2-day shipping, especially if the cost or the coordination is an issue. But when you're sampling leaves, make sure they go right into a cooler if you're going to be out in the field for a while, or sample them, bring them to a fridge and then go back out and do your other things.
You don't want them to freeze.
Nope, nope. And like I say, when you put the frozen juice bags or whatever you use, cheaper than the blue packs, make sure you put them in a paper bag or something to keep them from actually touching the leaf material with just a layer of plastic to protect them. It's you could freezer burn them and the cells break and you've made a mess.
Do you need about 250 leaves versus more?
Depends on the leaf. With tomatoes, you might only need half a dozen, but with apples, I pick until my tissue bag has about this many loose packed leaves in it, and it works out. You can kind of see. These are strawberry. No, these are apple leaves. I've got a larger Ziploc bag, and that bag is about that thick. So it's probably close to 60 to 80 leaves, I'd say.
Yeah, I would say that too. I mean, once the season gets going and the leaves get some size on them, the apples, yeah, I was shooting for around 80 new and old.
Yeah.
You got a weight on that, was that?
80 grams.
That's what they like. They work with significantly less, but when you start pushing that on, well, it's a big expense to ship a light sample for no results. So it's cheaper to spend the time and take more than you need.
The analysis is really done in Europe, not in this country, right?
Correct. They're squeezing.
Wherever it is, just as a collection point, right?
Yeah, we're sending them to Ohio, so it's not international shipping. And they turn around, repackage them in special foam containers and send hundreds of samples in at a time. So, anyway, that. If there's any other questions, I'll be around, so feel free to catch me.
Thank you.